Guys, welcome to episode 20 of Office Hours with Bob Ross. And thanks again for joining in. And thanks for all the support, the comments, the questions that you guys have. For today, what I want to discuss is dealing with dominant chords that are a half step apart from each other. And this could be a tough one. I don't know why it is that sometimes, at least for me, it feels like when you're addressing dominant chords a half step apart, it feels a little bit more daunting than addressing chords, major chords, or even minor chords that are a half step apart. And I don't know why that is. There's just something about dealing with the dominant chords where there's this sense of being overwhelmed. Maybe it's because of all the possibilities that exist over a dominant chord. However, what I want to do is just discuss a few basic things here with this. And this is something that I have addressed in some aspect when I put out the video for musiclessons.com on inside the composition when I, in that particular lesson, I dealt with Chick Corea's tune Windows. And as you know, if you know the tune, in Windows you have this part of the tune where it goes from the A flat to the A dominant back and forth. And one of the things that I did not want to do in dealing with the chord, those two chords going back and forth, is to take that and just run those changes, from the A flat to the A back and forth, just following them and not being able to transcend past that. So let me back up a moment. The first time I really dealt with these half-step dominant chords, there was a tune, if I remember correctly, it was a Joe Lovano tune called Symbolism. And I was trying to figure out a way to go back and forth between two dominant chords without basically change running, going from one to the next and not really being able to create anything more than just outlining chord tones. So one of the pieces of advice that was given to me by my professor at the time, this is when I was at UArts, was to find any sort of notes that you could use between two chords that are a half step apart and create basically like your own synthetic scale. Now, the thing with doing that with dominant chords is it starts to open up this possibility to almost include every single note as some sort of an alteration of the other dominant chord. So what I done instead of trying to make it so every note did fit is to go through and find the similarities in a very basic way without a lot of the alterations and just find, well, do these two notes are these two chords, are they sharing anything that's pretty, it's not going outside or playing outside so much. It's just outlining some basics, like maybe the 13th or the 7th. They're kind of interchanging a few chord tones back and forth. So that was one way that I worked on it. But I did spend a lot of time. I will say that going through and just playing between two dominant chords using only chord tones is a great thing to do. You have to get inside those changes. The one thing that I would say as guitar players, though, especially, is not to do this thing where you follow the pattern, a set pattern you have for like a dominant chord, playing the arpeggio and then sliding up a half step and then back down a half step, going back and forth. That's very limiting. So if I was to suggest one thing at least with dealing with those half-step motions between those two for a guitar player, I would say if you're starting playing your arpeggio for an A-flat 7 and you go to the A7, and let's say you move up a half step, can you then move up into another area of the fretboard when you go to the A-flat 7 and then move up another part of the fretboard when you go to an A7. So instead of getting caught in the back and forth motion, you transcend that and you go beyond that. Another thing that I would say is to stay in one area of the fretboard and don't allow that, again, that motion to dictate how you're going to flow in and out. You stay within that one area and you find all the possibilities in one little area. You don't go to your comfort zones on the guitar, because as guitar players, a lot of us do have these areas of the fretboard that we're very comfortable with. What I'm saying is to go into an area that is not so comfortable and get those chord tones mapped out really, really well, and then focus on changing out in between those two. Now also, if you find that there are any common tones between the dominant chords, then see if you can begin your phrase on one of those and then use that as the starting note of the next. So if I'm thinking about the two chords, let's say you're dealing with the A flat 7 and you have the G flat. When you go to an A7, that G flat, you can call it the F sharp, right? So, and that becomes the 13 of the chord. So in one case, it's acting as the flat 7, and then in the other case, it's acting as the 13. So what you could do is start a phrase that begins on that F sharp G flat note, and then when you go to the next chord, start a phrase there as well. That way, it's creating this limitation of creating a phrase that doesn't require you to constantly shift in and out between these familiar areas or following the pattern of the changes so much, you know, as far as in a guitaristic approach of where you're just using these set patterns under your fingers. So it's making you think outside of maybe what is a comfortable setting for you. Another thing that I like to do in working on the half-step motion is to take a look at the tonal centers, the key areas that these two are coming from. And I'm reducing this down to a very basic way of seeing it. So if I have an A flat 7, I'm just going to call that as being part of the D flat major tonality, and then the A7 coming out D major tonality. So what I'll do, and if you're unfamiliar with the way I see the fretboard with the shapes, then I'll post up a link to the 5 shapes course that I have on music lessons. But I see the area, and it's not caged. I've talked about this before. I don't see it as the cage system. I see it as the 5 shapes, similar to what Jimmy Bruno talks about. So there's similarities, but there's also a few differences that I see. So let's say I'm going back and forth, and I just want to think about the tonal areas or those key centers. Then what I'll do is put on these 2 chords, you know, with a loop pedal, have these 2 looping back and forth, these 2 chords. And what I'll do is I'll start running up through in D flat, and then I'll make the transition into D, and I'll keep the line moving, right? Because I'm thinking very basic in terms of what is the tonal areas that I'm in. So I'll run up through in D flat, and then I'll go into D, and I'll keep the line moving. So it might be an ascending line. I'll keep that ascending line moving. Maybe I'm using quarter notes as my rhythmic limitation in this case. And I'll run this line up through, and when it gets to a new key area, I keep it going. And then when I need to turn back around to go back down, I have to keep in mind that the line continues to flow regardless of that chord changing. I have to keep the line moving. I can't go back to a note that's, you know, the usual note or some lick or pattern I'm used to playing to accommodate those changes. So this is going to force you to really think, and you're going to have to slow it down. Maybe you write out a couple of these lines for yourself at first, or really just be very conscious of it when you're practicing, and don't do it in time just yet. But run these lines and figure out how exactly am I going to go from this one note to the other and keep the line moving, and also be comfortable under the fingers. Because sometimes when you're running through something and you make a transition or a shift, you have to be conscious of how that's going to lay out under your fingers as well. And then the other being, you could do the same thing that I mentioned a moment ago about the chord tones. So you're going up through the fretboard and you're running this line, but you just keep transcending through all the different shapes of the 2 tonal centers, those key areas, as you're going up through. Another thing that you could do is to take a small little motive or a phrase, whether, you know, it's something specific harmonically that you're playing, or if it's something rhythmically specific, and apply it to those changes as they're going by. So now you have a different component that you have to think about, where it's not the harmonic motion, the chords going back and forth that you're so focused upon. It's, can I make this rhythmic statement or this melodic phrase work as these two chords are shifting back and forth? That's going to take you away from being so focused in on this change running, going back and forth with the pattern. And another thing to add to that is the chordal component of this as well. So if you're also trying to comp between these two chords, again, it's one of those things, especially as a guitar player, I can't speak for all the other instruments, but for a guitar player, if we have an A flat 7 chord that we're playing and then we have an A7, it's very common just to follow that pattern back and forth. But what if you create an exercise to where you're running up through the fretboard, and when you're comping, you got to keep the line moving. You got to keep maybe the top note of the chord running up through. You have to keep the motion going up, and you're not just going, a fourth fret voicing of it, fourth, fifth, back and forth. Because I can see where, at times maybe you get into that and you can create and keep that going. That doesn't really, you're allowing, again, the changes to dictate how you're going to comp the tune, and you don't want that. You got to get past that. Another thing that you could do, and I'm throwing out a lot of little things here, so with any of these, just keep in mind that you want to work on these for an extended period of time. Don't look at it as you got to do them all at once. Is to take the 2 chord that goes along with it. So in the case of the A flat 7, you have an E flat minor 7, and A7 you have an E minor 7. So what you could do is think about, if you're more comfortable with thinking in, minor, then you could run lines that are comfortable for you that accommodate a minor 7 chord as opposed to that dominant chord. The other thing you could also do is use pentatonics on this. Sometimes when that motion of A flat and A7 are going back and forth, what I like to do is to use a minor pentatonic, and when that chord hits over into the A7, when you're going to the A7, it creates a little bit of dissonance, but that's okay. It's something that's buttoned up against the harmony a bit, but it works. I wouldn't do it every single time as a, I guess, cop out in a sense, because you want to know the notes really well and be able to spell out those changes. But it's something to also be aware of, that you could throw that in and also get some lines happening and maybe loosen up this very strict sense of I have to outline these changes really well. So those, and the first thing, I'll even go back, this is number 1 right here, is the melody. Whatever tune that you're playing, associate the melody with it. Now in this case, with when I'm talking about Windows, that melody runs right along with it. So it's not too terribly difficult to apply that melody to it. But you take another tune like Stablemates, where those chords are running half step up, which to me feels a little bit easier than doing the back and forth between the two. Be very aware of the melody of the tune. I mean, use the melody. If you keep it very basic and you run the melody, and you also think about the chord tones, you can get a lot from that and just create like maybe some interest with adding a little bit more variation to the melody, or developing a melodic or rhythmic idea to put over top of it. It really doesn't have to be that complicated. You don't have to freak out over the chords and feel like you have to do something that's way over the top or play outside all the time. So keep it very basic, and then you can go from there once you're pretty comfortable with those changes. Well, hopefully you use a couple of those ideas into your practice. Again, don't try to do everything at one time. It's a few ideas, start with one, and you can get a lot from it. I've taken a couple of these ideas and done a lot with just a couple of the ideas. So, put that into your practice and see what you can do. Again, I'll put up a link to the lesson I have on Windows that I create on musiclessons.com, as well as the 5 shapes video, in case you're unfamiliar with where I'm coming from with that. That way you can check those out. There's previews on those videos. That way you can just get a basic idea of what they're about. And as always, if there's any other questions, comments, or anything, make sure that you leave them. That way I can address anything about this particular topic or any other future topics and questions that you want me to cover in the future. All right, guys, again, thanks for all your support. And, keep those questions, comments coming. It really helps it helps me to get these coming my way. That way I can think about some of the things that maybe I didn't think so much about in the past. Some of these things I get so locked into my own thoughts and have my ways to approach it that I sometimes assume everybody thinks about these things. So, keep those questions coming. It really helps me to analyze where I'm coming from and solidify some responses. Thanks again, and I will see you guys next time.